This is a 25 marker from Edexcel Paper 3. The marker reads, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors which determine the number of firms in an industry. Refer to hand car washes or other industries of your choice, or another industry of your choice. As always, I would say have a look at the question, come up with your own answer, and then see how it compares to what I end up writing. And if it's sort of different, maybe put it in the comments below so other people can see other potential solutions to this, and we can sort of talk through different options. There's never just one way to answer these. As always with the sort of paper 3 questions, I'm trying to do one microeconomic and one macroeconomic factor. Here you can see from my microeconomic factor, I'm talking about oligopolistic behavior. And here specifically, I'm probably interested in the sort of behavior of firms that are going to exclude other firms from entering a market. So if you have things like predatory pricing or limit pricing, or if you have sort of collusion within the market, maybe lobbying or petitioning the government to increase regulations, to increase barriers to entry. Those are going to be major factors that are going to stop new firms from entering a market, and they will limit the number of firms available. And then my second point, which is going to be my macroeconomic, will be talking more generally about the state of the overall economic performance, so things like growth, unemployment, inflation, and how that might affect the number of firms in a particular market. In this case, it says refer to an industry of your choice. I might think about supermarkets as my example. So we're looking for definitions, diagrams. I would do application, and analysis and evaluation. So I would say oligopolistic firms may use a number of strategies to ensure new entrants to a market cannot join. These would include predatory / limit pricing. They might include raising barriers to entry through regulation, intimidating other partners to prevent them from working with new entrants. And then the effect of this is going to be to reduce the likelihood of new entrants joining the market, and also to show, and then the effect of that is going to be like worse outcomes for consumers. If I'm talking about oligopoly, I could use this diagram here, the kinked supply and demand diagram, right, to show basically why firms are likely to congregate around P1, why we're limiting output to Q1, and how we've got differences in elasticity above P1 and below P1. That would be sort of used to illustrate why there is generally going to be price stability in oligopolistic markets. But you might also refer to like a lot of these strategies don't have a ton to do with this diagram specifically. So you're also going to want to rely on like your analysis to make the argument. There's not really a specific diagram for predatory or limit pricing. We could say raising barriers through regulation, that's going to lead to higher fixed costs. And that's going to require a higher level of output to break even. If you've got higher startup costs, for example, and you're making a certain amount of profit for a product, you're going to need to sell way more of those products to acquire enough total profit to then be able to pay off your fixed costs. So the point where you actually like break even as a business is going to need to be a much higher level of output than you normally would have if you had lower fixed costs, for example. So increasing barriers to entry like that sort of make it harder for new firms entering the market to acquire profitability. Predatory and limit pricing, again, I would illustrate that maybe you could look at it in terms of sort of the holistic competition diagram also to show sort of average costs and how you might be trying to set, say, a market price that is below the average cost curve for a certain firm. So you're setting prices below average cost curves for specific firms. You may be taking advantage of your economies of scale. Again, thinking about course material you can use, taking advantage of your economies of scale to be able to afford a lower price. You might even be pricing at a loss for yourself, and you might be willing to sort of continue on with that pricing strategy because you have access to financing. Maybe you have more of reserves of cash in your business itself. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to deal with lower prices than newer entrants to the market that might be smaller. So I'd be thinking about, in terms of definitions, we might be defining stuff like economies of scale. We might define pricing strategies, like specific ones like limit or predatory pricing. We might be defining terms like barriers to entry, right? So it just depends what you're kind of focusing on with this argument. In terms of the application, I might say, existing supermarkets like Tesco and Morrison's may try to bully suppliers into not working with newer entrants like Aldi and Lidl. This would be sort of referencing when Aldi and Lidl entered the UK market for the first time, right? So when they were new entrants. Now they're well established, but at the time, they would have been newer firms trying to compete on price. Obviously, I don't think Tesco and Morrison's did limit pricing, but they did try to price match their competitors. The evaluation here might be, this depends on how many firms are in the market to begin with. So if you already have a market that's like more competitive, it's much harder to engage in these strategies to prevent new firms from entering. So markets with fewer firms are more likely to continue to have fewer firms. Whereas maybe once you get over a certain limit, maybe once you're at sort of 7, 8, 9 competitors, new firms can enter relatively easily because it's very hard to elude on these sort of strategies. You could use also the game theory diagram for like the chart for showing the incentives to collude or not collude. Because effectively the firms are colluding on limit pricing, because what you don't want, say, is for Tesco to choose to really lower its prices, but Morrison's keeps them at the same level, right? You're going to kind of force all of the firms to enter a price war in order to get rid of the new entrant. So there does need to be some level of collusion on that as a strategy. And there maybe are incentives to defect, because then you can remain profitable as a business and maybe your competitors run themselves into the ground. So it depends on how many firms. There is a risk government intervention, as many of these strategies fall foul of pro-competition legislation. There's always the risk of defection of some parties to collusion. So these are all options you have in terms of how to evaluate it. And then when we say we've got overall economic performance, this is kind of a catch-all argument, because I'm trying to place the macroeconomic context for why a market like this is maybe going to have more firms or fewer firms. So there's a few different arguments I'm going to make here in my analysis. So I'm going to say first that higher rates of growth increase overall demand in specific markets, and that then allows space for more competitors as revenues can rise for most firms, even if new entrants are added to the market. By contrast, shrinking growth forces firms to compete for a smaller customer base, resulting in some firms being forced from the market. So that's an argument about growth, right? The more economic growth there is, the more opportunity there is going to be in a market. That might encourage new entrants to enter that market, but it also is going to make it a lot easier for firms to coexist because you're fighting over a growing pie as opposed to a shrinking pie, right? If the market opportunity is shrinking, things are going to get pretty cutthroat between different companies, and probably it's not a big enough market anymore for everyone to be able to compete. Second, high inflation would drive up costs, forcing some firms out of the market because they are no longer profitable. And finally, labor shortages or low unemployment may increase labor costs for firms and make it difficult for them to find suitable labor, which again is going to lead to some firms being forced from the market because they can't be profitable anymore. So effectively, like I'm just maybe going through a range of different macroeconomic conditions and pointing out how they're going to affect the number of firms in a given market. And here my case that I want to reference is again supermarkets. So during recessions, supermarkets compete more on price, which may for fewer customers, which may force the closures of some high street locations when rent payments are too high. So that would be an example of like why you end up with fewer firms in a market. And then for the valuation, I would probably here be talking about why it really depends on the type of market. If firms are making massive profits, then increased prices due to inflation or increased costs due to inflation may be less of a problem. So again, if we're in a market where it's more maybe of like a perfectly competitive type of market, that's our structure, then there's going to be more competition of price to begin with. Firms are less likely to have significant profit margins, and that means increases in prices either have to be passed on to consumers, or some firms are going to be forced out of the market and forced to close because they're no longer profitable.